Hello, my name is the Vulgar Marxist. We are going to do another experiment, as it is 90 degrees where I am at and I am going to be goddamned if I miss another video for another month. So, we are now going to try doing my end with text-to-speech, and hope that in the future my tractor does not make too much noise to record. Yes, that is the good news. I got a new job, so I will be spending significant amounts of time sitting indoors, and can hopefully produce more videos for you that way. Maybe. I hope. So I am not going to risk the Rockwell video on an experiment. I want that to be done properly. I want that to bury that subject in one fell swoop. So that is getting done later, my apologies. But in the meantime, guess who we get to deal with again? Mexie. Discussing universal basic income. This is one of the things that really entertains me about this subject. Everyone hates it. Conservatives hate it. Neoliberals hate it. Feminists hate it. Everyone with a stake in continuing some unjustified hierarchy in some form absolutely will look for any reason they can find why UB will not work. And they keep finding the same nonsensical stupid as hell reasons. I mean really dumb. That's not how economics functions at all reasons. So what am I to think, if not that famous Kropotkin quote?
That we are utopians is well known. So utopian are we that we go the length of believing that the revolution can and ought to assure shelter, food and clothes to all, an idea extremely displeasing to middle-class citizens, whatever their particular, for they are quite alive to the fact that it is not easy to keep the upper hand of a people whose hunger is satisfied.
And what are all these objections, if not that exact principle on a grandiose scale? But I get ahead of myself. Mexie, take it away.
So today is going to be a discussion style video. It's going to be a little different than my typical lecture at you videos, and it'll be a comparison of UBI, Universal Basic Income, and Le Salaire à Vie, which is a concept by Bernard Friot. Excuse my ridiculous French accent. So I'm not an expert on Le Salaire à Vie, but followers have told me that nobody is actually talking about this in English. So I wanted to, I guess, insert this into the discourse around basic income in English and maybe inspire people to think more about it and start discussions around how we might turn UBI, which is coming. It's an eventuality, so how might we turn that into something that could potentially be useful for revolutionary politics?
The reason I am doing things this way is that I had already responded to Mexie's video in her comments section, and realized that I had just written an entire video response, so I went, okay, let's just do a video response. First, UB is not a necessary eventuality under capitalism. We will get into that later. The fact that any discussion about payment is the current debate tells you that it is on the margins, as a UB, correctly implemented, would be functionally self-paying. Again, we will get into that down the road.
But UBI is inevitable. It's coming. There, I said it. The contradictions of capitalism will not allow it to continue reproducing itself without a lifeline like UBI. Capitalism reproduces itself only by creating an ever greater reserve army of labor, meaning people who are either unemployed, underemployed, or employed precariously or in the informal economy that is largely superfluous to capital.
False. Capitalism reproduces itself by creating an ever greater market to sell goods to. The reserve army of labor is the mechanism by which profits are generated. However, without consumption, the reserve army is meaningless. When the supply of a commodity increases, its price falls. When it decreases, price rises. By flooding the market with too many workers, capitalism debases wages below their optimal equilibrium rate, allowing enterprises which would otherwise be totally unprofitable to suddenly become profitable. However, the era of mercantilism, and free trade more generally, shows us that without markets to sell to, all of this debased wage production is meaningless. The capitalists cannot sell $20,000 cars to people who make $15,000 a year. They need consumers with money in order to sell goods, but cannot pay their workers, or their business becomes unprofitable. This is one of the central contradictions of capitalism.
There are many ways that capitalism ensures the growth of this reserve pool of labor, and you can check out my video on the topic to learn more about this. But one way is automation. Automation is a natural part of the growth of capitalism because in order to stay competitive, capitalists must be constantly revolutionizing their production process to make production as cheap as possible so that their profits continue to rise.
I am going to skip a very large argument about automation versus women's entry into the labor force here, simply stating that if you found 50 million women who were willing to feed cloth and house a non-working partner, I would be the very first to volunteer to sit in their basement playing video games all day long. Good point on globalism.
Neoliberalism and free trade have also contributed greatly to this by pitting workers around the world into competition with one another. If workers strike or demand better working conditions in any way, then because capital can move and labor can't, it just incentivizes them to offshore production and get people in the third world to do it for very cheap, or to automate and just replace those workers entirely. So this is a complete global race to the bottom in terms of wages and working conditions. So this may be hyperbolic, but we're reaching a point where up to 50% of the global workforce could be replaced by automation in the next few decades. When people have no jobs, they can't purchase anything, and so the economy flops because you run into a problem of effective demand. If there's nobody to purchase all the goods that are being produced, then you run into the crisis of overaccumulation and consequent stagnation. So everyone who's asking, how are we going to afford UBI, is in for a real rude awakening when they realize that the only options we have are A, implement UBI to save capitalism.
The collapse in wages starting in the mid-70s has now reduced GDP growth from 10% to less than 3%, not adjusted for inflation. Inflation adjusted is actually just as bad. What we need to make note of for later is that as the wealth has concentrated at the top, the economy has stagnated. Note, first the number of workers goes up, then wages fall, then the wealth of the few increases, then productivity starts collapsing. This chain of events will be very important later.
B, watch our entire economic system implode and take everyone down with it, including the rich. Or C, let it burn and start the revolution to a luxury, fully automated communist utopia. What? Just saying. So the positives for revolutionary politics are few, although it really depends on exactly which form of UBI would be implemented.
The potential for revolutionary change is breathtaking. The share of the 1% fell from 20% of the economy to less than 9% of the economy from 1930 to 1960, the most devastating blow to capital short of full-on revolution I am aware of. This is due, in my opinion, to the steady decline in employment to population during this period. As the reserve army, or the female portion anyway, decided to stay home and make cookies, wages increased, and profits fell proportionally. Again, I love making cookies. 50 million women willing to feed non-working partners, find them.
If it's a living wage, it could potentially disrupt some of the power that employers have over employees and perhaps give people the opportunity to pursue things that they are actually good at and passionate about, because they wouldn't be stuck scraping along working 2 to 3 jobs just trying to survive.
That said, by allowing huge number of workers to choose to cease selling labor, it follows that wages will reverse, increasing at the expense of capital. This is one of the major breaking points I have with most modern communists. My goal is not the destruction of the economy at large, merely the abolition of the capitalist class. If I could get a system of worker-owned co-ops functioning in market competition with each other, I would consider that victory enough.
They'll be able to afford education for their children, etc. So it has the potential to alleviate some of the worst pressures of capitalism, namely that it sees everyone as undeserving of food and shelter unless they are turning a profit for a capitalist. The best positive in my mind is that it could challenge the idea that a person's worth should be tied to their productive labor. It could potentially bring on this society-wide recognition or a shift in people's thinking to understand that meritocracy is bullshit it does not work for the majority of people, increasingly more and more people.
Okay, meritocracy is bullshit, but not for the reason you named. Meritocracy is a lie. What is meritocracy? The idea that the harder you work the more you will get. However, we have already shown that the more hours are sold, the less each hour is worth, and the less hours are sold, the more each hour is worth. This leads to a system where decreasing your effort results in increased income, as the increase in the value of each hour is greater than the decrease in total hours sold. If I sell 60 hours at $8 I get $480. If I sell 30 hours at $20, I get $600. This is why meritocracy is bullshit, not because it only works for some people, because it works for no one. Those who benefit from meritocracy are not actually subject to market forces and their wages.
But despite being superfluous to capital, our fellow human beings still deserve food and water and shelter and love. Yay! So it has the potential to shift people's thinking around individualism and the labor market. But if it's not a living wage, and if it's not universal, and if it's given instead of all other social services like healthcare and etc., instead of on top of those services, then it has the potential to become pretty dystopian. So here we come to the negatives, and I am getting very sweaty, so I apologize. So like I said, it could be used as a means to privatize and individualize all other social provisioning. It bears mentioning that the architects of neoliberalism like Milton Friedman and Hayek were in favor of a UBI because they saw it as a way to lower people's benefits and maintain a large pool of low-wage workers.
Guilt by association. I have never understood why people think that Friedman and Hayek being in favor of something means we must necessarily oppose it. Communists and libertarians are functioning from completely opposite assumptions about how the economy functions. Let me try a simple example. You are a vegan, and Friedman and Hayek oppose beef subsidies. Now removing these would raise the price of beef, lowering meat consumption. Would you oppose lowering beef consumption simply because Friedman and Hayek support it? The functional assumption of Marxism, as I understand it, is that markets cannot and have never set wages efficiently, that is that the existence of the reserve army has always debased wages below their market-efficient rate. This would explain, even in neoliberal terms, why falling wages stagnate the economy. Neoliberals' assumption is that markets have always set wages efficiently. You yourself say that they assume wages are too high, while we assume they are too low. From our perspective, there is every reason to assume that a UB will massively reduce the labor force, which we note to be overlarge, the existence of the reserve army itself, whereas neolibs assume the labor force to be correct and thus have no reason to expect shrinkage.
They called it a negative income tax, and they pushed for it because they thought that unemployment benefits were holding wages too high. Paul Cockshott explains that if you want to get somebody to work, you have to pay at least 50% more than the unemployment benefits in order to make it worth their while.
Non sequitur. While anecdotal evidence cannot support an argument, it can most certainly refute one. I would very happily quit my job for 1/4 of what I am currently being paid. There is absolutely no reason to think that people who have the option of not working at horrible jobs they hate are going to continue to do so if they have the option of not selling labor. Further, this is anathema to the basic principles of market economics. If you lower the sale price of a commodity, supply decreases. That the neoliberals do not even believe in supply and demand as it relates to wages tells you all you need to know about neoliberalism and the role of wage labor in capitalist economics. Allow the workers to choose if they want to sell at the prevailing rate, and the whole thing tumbles to the ground.
So the neoliberal economist idea was, why don't we pay the benefit to everyone, and then you could pay half the unemployment benefit as a wage and you would still get people coming to work for that. Doing that would ensure that you always had a pool of people who were just desperate for low-wage work.
I work in truck driving. We are 50,000 drivers short. Wages have increased, over the last 3 years, from $40,000 to $70,000 simply because there are not enough people. companies are currently offering $10,000 sign-on bonuses to drivers. Yeah, you heard that right, $10,000 in your bank, just to show up and say hello, I am here. Because, again, not enough people. The concern companies have for their workers is directly proportional to the scarcity of those workers. A UB, correctly implemented, would make nearly all wage labor scarce, draining labor out of the market and forcing wages up. Not only would this benefit domestic workers, but immigrant labor would also benefit from increased wages, even if they do not get the UB.
So, number two, it could become just a subsidy for business that would remove any responsibility for companies to actually need to take care of their workers at all and make sure that they pay them well or provide them benefits or anything. Also, it's only for citizens. So that has the potential to marginalize and make immigrants and refugees even more vulnerable than they already are. Also, not every country in the world could afford implementing a UBI, especially if they're in the clutches of the World Bank or the IMF. They likely have to prioritize loan repayments over servicing their citizens in the slightest. And potentially the scariest part is if no one is a worker anymore, let's say we're all on our UBIs and there's no work for us, we're all superfluous to capital, what kind of collective bargaining power does a mob of unemployed people have who are just sitting there getting money given to them by the government?
The collective bargaining power of continued GDP growth. Look again at the graphs at the start. As wages fell, consumption fell and GDP stagnated. Now, numbers time. A reduction in wages from 52% of GDP to 44% of GDP dropped growth from 10% to 3%, or 6% to 2% real. Let's assume a 2% reduction in wages per GDP results in a 1% reduction in GDP growth. The most bare-bones UB would be $16,000 a year per person, so that would total $5.2 trillion, or 28% of GDP. This is a 16% reduction in wages per GDP, tanking growth to -5%. Can you imagine the US economy shrinking 5% annually? For a decade? Can you imagine the panic among the capitalists? It's not the people at the top who are going to be complacent. It is the people at the top who will be shrieking and screaming at the top of their collective lungs.
If we're operating this still within a system of owners and laborers, then the people at the top can just say, you know, like, well, what are you complaining about? You're already getting your UBI, you're already getting your handouts. So I feel like that could make it harder for workers to organize because we're no longer workers. And they can just say, you know, well, we don't have any more money to give you, so... And in terms of its potential to disrupt some of the power that the employer has over the employee, again, if we're doing this within a capitalist framework where there are two classes, the class of owners and the class of laborers, the capitalists and the government, I mean, they're not going to actually make UBI a living wage. Like, they're not going to make UBI a way that workers are going to be actually able to just exit the workforce if they so choose. Like, they would have no incentive to do that. In fact, the complete opposite.
And here you are correct. This is why the crackhead you mentioned at the start tanked the experiment. Because the government and the capitalists already understand what a UB does to them. Which is entirely the point. We need a functioning UB because they know it will cripple them and we know it too. Because what it will not do is keep the system going, and they know that. Now if I could just get you to understand that, this would be wonderful.
So UBI under a capitalist framework has the potential to be really, really dystopian. Because it's just a mob of people being fed money, just enough money, so that they can continue this system of consumption, consumption, consumption for no other reason other than consumption and waste to keep the growth-oriented, profit-seeking system going. For no other reason. And ultimately, this will never solve the contradictions of capitalism. We'll still run into the contradictions of overaccumulation, stagnation, and the contradiction of environmental limits. I mean, if we're still just feeding people money in order that they can keep the consumption machine going, in a for-profit growth-oriented system, then that's never going to be sustainable. I mean, this is never going to be something that's going to be anything more than a band-aid to hold capitalism together as it crumbles and circles the drain. So now we come to le salaire à vie, even sweatier. And le salaire à vie attempts to address a lot of the problems with UBI, namely that it still operates within a capitalist, growth-oriented, exploitative system that doesn't actually challenge the contradictions of capitalism. Bernard Friot wants to challenge the use-value, exchange-value binary that exists under capitalism. So if I cleaned this apartment right now, for example, I would be producing a use value, not an exchange value, because it wouldn't contribute to the GDP, nobody would be profiting off of it. But the minute that somebody, like a company, contracts me out to do the exact same labor, producing the exact same use value, suddenly this has an exchange value. Suddenly this is productive labor because somebody is profiting off of my labor.
Incorrect. You are confusing exchange value with transaction. Let me quote Proudhon here: if the laborer, who adds to the value of a thing, has a right of property in it, he who maintains this value acquires the same right. For what is maintenance? It is incessant addition, continuous creation. What is it to cultivate? It is to give the soil its value every year. It is, biannually renewed creation, to prevent the diminution or destruction of the value of a piece of land. End quote. The same is true of your apartment, and cleaning. You prevent the diminution of the value of the apartment. The company which owns the apartment benefits the difference between the value of an apartment filled with roaches and the value of an apartment with no roaches. There are huge numbers of exchanges which do not actually involve any transaction, and Marxists need to be careful that in correcting one problem we do not exacerbate another. Simply because an exchange does not involve any green bits of paper does not mean it is not an exchange, nor does it mean it is necessarily exploitative or fair. The example I love to give is that if you count the additional cost of shelter, food and clothing to the working partner, stay-at-home partners are paid at a rate of $14 per hour, significantly higher than their working counterparts. Yet because Mugwin Piper, everyone assumes the exchange is exploitative.
And that could contribute to the GDP, etc. Friot believes that everyone produces valuable use values in their lives, and one's worth or one's salary and ability to live a life of dignity should not be based around the metric of exchange value, which is founded on exploitation and the whole contradictory capitalist framework that we just discussed.
So he is not actually a communist. There is a difference between everyone could produce use value and everyone does produce use value. Speculation has no use value. Neither does rent-seeking. One of the central concepts of Kropotkin is that if everyone were actually required to produce use value, the total of all labor time in society would be reduced to 30 hours per week. I have redone the math here, and in modern times, it would be 15 hours per week, with only 25 to 55-year-olds working. Just pause and think about that a second. We could produce a UB for everyone, $16,000 a year, if all 25 to 55-year-olds worked 15 hours a week. Does he even mention hours worked here? At all?
So UBI is given to you by the state, and it's financed through taxes, presumably taxing the middle and working classes more, because let's face it, I don't think they're going to be taxing the billionaires or cutting down on the defense budget. And with UBI, you get a basic income, but you have to supplement that with further work for a capitalist.
Not relevant. Let me put it this way, if I told you that you could pay me $300 a week to sit in a basement, and the result of this would be a $500 pay raise for you, your answer would be?
Le salaire à vie proposes that the main, or perhaps only, income that people are getting is the salaire à vie. The salary would vary by age and whether or not you pursue higher qualifications. So at 18, you would start getting the base salary of, let's say, 1,500 euros per month. But if you get diplomas, etc., that improve your ability to do whatever job that you do, then you advance your salaire à vie.
And the problem I have here is not all jobs or degrees are useful. You could have someone getting master's degree after master's degree, who never actually produces any utility, but whose stipend is double that of, say, a factory worker or a farm worker. This merely uses the difference between use value and transaction to create a new class of capitalists, those who benefit from the labor of others but are not and have no intention of contributing reciprocal labor.
There's also accumulation of experience points, which you get just from working. So as you get older, you'll hit thresholds where the salary will rise. I assume this is true whether or not you are working a job, or if you are not working a job, because presumably you're still producing use values in your life, whatever you are doing. So I believe that the points, even if you're not working a conventional job, you would still accumulate points, but probably if you are working a conventional job, then you would accumulate more points to advance your salary. And there would be a cap for how high any salary could go, for example, 6,000 euros per month. Unlike UBI, le salaire à vie would be financed by the total production of the country. So each company, whatever profits it makes above whatever it takes to merely keep running the business, like energy costs or raw material supply, is put into a central coffer, which is then distributed to all citizens. So bosses would no longer control the salaries of their workers, and also the power of landlords would be abolished.
Yeah, this sounds like state corporatism. The baseline number is 1500 which comes to 18,000 a year. There are about 250 million working-age adults in the EU, so that is a total of 5 trillion EU out of a 14 trillion GDP. So it is functionally the same correctly structured UB, except instead of markets using the capitalists for a piñata, we are stuck with government agents arbitrarily dictating what will or will not get rewarded. Why would I expect a factory worker or stevedore to get paid more than a gender studies or art history doctorate under this system? I would like to take this section at the end to go through some numbers, because the more I think about this the more bullshit it sounds. Maybe this guy was doing his math in the 1990s or something, but when I was in my 20s I had to live off of $1,200 a month and it sucked. Hard. With teeth. But that is not even the point. Right now, Europe has a total population of 511 million, with about 250 million people of working age. Their GDP is 14.5 trillion in euros, let's call it 15 to keep numbers simple. Now, let's say the median income ends up 3,000 a month under le salaire, or 36,000 a year. That's a total of $9 trillion annually. So what the hell is happening to the other 6 trillion? And that is assuming you get to a median of 3,000 from a baseline of 1,500. So let's run the numbers backwards. Now trucking companies that roll over their entire fleets every 4 years spend less than 15% of revenue on equipment, so I am going with that being the outside. So out of 15 trillion, we have 12.5 not going to capital stock. Divide that by 250 million workers, and you get about 4,000 per month stipend, 2.5 times what le salaire is listing as its baseline. Now, if we want a range, okay, let's say starting at 3,000 a month and growing from there. But what I am seeing from the proposal made is an old PhD holder who wants to change class exploitation from capitalists to old PhD holders. And yes, I am being slightly hypocritical here. I have often and vigorously proposed an income tax that would limit high earners to 25 times the median wage. But that was in a capitalist economy, not in a state corporatism economy. If the state has direct control of the economy, I frankly see no reason why you would have so large a range on salaries, particularly with so low a starting point. Now again, maybe this guy was writing in the 1980s or something. I have done some digging and I cannot even find a wiki page for this thing. But if this is a recent idea and the baseline is that low, then I am afraid I have to firmly oppose it, particularly if it is attached to a 40-hour workweek or higher. That said, I sincerely hope I am able to resume voice critique over the next month. We will run another test in a week or two and see. Good night and good luck.